Good afternoon. Now I'd like to start the Esri Policy Forum, talking with US experts on the US fiscal policy. I'm excited to host this event with such distinguished speakers and great audience here, and also online audience with more than 100 people. I'm Tomoko Hayashi, Director General of Economic Research Bureau, Cabinet Office, and Chief Economist of the Japanese government, reporting on economic situation to the Prime Minister and other ministers. Let me introduce the speakers today. On my right, Professor Douglas Elmendorf from Harvard University. Doug covers a wide range of fields of public finance and fiscal policy. Doug has held important positions in Washington, D.C., such as the Council of Economic Advisors to the President, CEA, and Department of the Treasury, and also served as Federal Reserve Board and Director of the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, from 2009 to 15. Today, we have the privilege of hearing a keynote address from Professor Elmendorf on the US public finance and fiscal conditions. Next, it is a great honor to introduce Professor Alan Auerbach from the University of California, Berkeley. Alan is so famous and prominent that there's no need to explain. However, for the online Japanese audience, I'll say a few words. Professor Auerbach is an expert in public finance, generational accounting, and tax policy. Professor Auerbach also served as panel member of economic advisors of the US Congressional Budget Office and president of the National Tax Association. 2 years ago, the Japanese government expressed sincere gratitude for his enormous contributions to the US-Japan relationship and awarded Professor Auerbach the distinguished honor of the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Race with Neck Ribbon from His Majesty the Emperor, known as Kyokujitsu Jusho in Japanese. On the far right, Professor Junko Koeda from Waseda University. Professor Koeda is an expert in macroeconomics and international finance. After earning a PhD from UCLA, Professor Koeda worked for the IMF. Returning to Japan, she served as lecturer at the University of Tokyo and as associate professor at Waseda University. On the screen, Mr. Kaneta Sato is the economic counselor at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. Before assuming the current position, Sato-san worked for the Cabinet Office in Tokyo for more than 20 years, where he was involved in making economic and fiscal policies and projections and conducting research on the global economy. In 2020, Sato-san was appointed as chief economist at the embassy, and he has been in charge of research on the US economy and macroeconomic policies, contributing the foundation of various foreign policies, in particular, the US-Japan relationship. On my left, Shingo Nakazawa from the Esri, Executive Research Fellow. Thank you, and let me express my gratitude to the distinguished speakers for joining us today. Now I'd like to invite Professor Elmendorf to deliver the keynote address at the podium.
You haven't missed anything. U.S. Federal government debt is now roughly equal to our gross domestic product, well above where it was just 4 years ago, and now close to its highest level in history. Two significant recessions and the policy responses to them pushed up debt markedly, but an underlying imbalance between spending and revenue has mattered as well. Moreover, under current law, debt will rise continuously and substantially relative to GDP in the coming decades. This projection is from the Congressional Budget Office's latest long-term budget outlook. Of course, the future is very uncertain. Consider, for example, productivity growth. Total factor productivity increased an average of 2% per year in the United States in the decade between 1995 and 2004, but it has risen less than 1% per year since then. So the forecast of 1.1% annual growth that underlies CBO's projection of debt is plausible, but could easily be much too high or much too low. Similarly, CBO's forecasts of interest rates, health spending, and so on could be wrong. Recognizing this uncertainty, CBO tests the sensitivity of its projections. If productivity growth were 0.5 percentage point higher or lower than forecast in every year, the ratio of debt to GDP would be as low or high as shown in this chart. You can see that the range of uncertainty is very large, and if we layered on top the uncertainty regarding interest rates and other factors that matter for future debt, the range would be even larger. But there is little reason to think that debt will stabilize relative to GDP on its own, and there are plausible scenarios in which debt rises dramatically. Therefore, putting the U.S. government budget on a sustainable path will almost certainly require significant changes to tax law, spending programs, or both. The fundamental problem is the large gap between spending and revenue today. Let's begin by recognizing that a large share of spending by the U.S. government is for pensions and healthcare, primarily for older Americans. In 2024, the data shown here, Social Security benefits, which are pensions primarily for older Americans, will be almost 1/4 of all U.S. government spending. Another nearly 1/4 of spending will go to our major healthcare programs, including Medicare and Medicaid, that pay for healthcare for older Americans and pay for healthcare and long-term care for lower-income Americans. Most of the money goes to benefits for older Americans because they have greater needs, of course, for healthcare and long-term care. Another roughly 10% of spending will go for interest on the debt. So we're up to about 60% of spending by the U.S. government before we get to anything else the government does. The remaining roughly 40% of spending goes for other benefit programs, the military, infrastructure investment, education, and so on. Meanwhile, total revenue will be much smaller, only about 3/4 as large as outlays. Revenue will be split about evenly between individual income taxes and all other taxes, which include a payroll tax and a corporate profits tax. As you probably know, the U.S. government does not have a value-added tax, although our state governments generally impose sales taxes. So the deficit in 2024 will be nearly 6% of GDP, well above the average of the past few decades of about 3.5%. The result will be a further increase in debt relative to GDP. But there is much more to come in the medium and long term. The main causes of unsustainability over time are population aging and rising healthcare spending per person. Like Japan and many other countries, the U.S. has an aging population. The share of Americans who are 65 and older is rising significantly because of both increasing longevity and declining fertility. Indeed, CBO projects that by the early 2040s, deaths will exceed births in the United States, and the population will grow rather than shrink only through immigration. As a result of population aging, spending for Social Security will increase relative to GDP. In addition, healthcare spending per person in the United States has increased faster than GDP per person for many years and will probably continue to do so. Therefore, spending on the major healthcare programs will be pushed up by both population aging and rising healthcare costs per person. So healthcare spending rises especially rapidly. These patterns are not surprising to analysts. When I was in graduate school, analysts drew projections like this and said, look what will happen if we don't make changes in policy. And in fact, we have not made very large changes in policy. The projections have happened. Baby boomers have now mostly retired, in fact, and this leaves us with a considerable challenge going forward. All other non-interest spending is projected to decline relative to GDP. This feature of the projection may be surprising, and it arises for a couple of reasons. One is that for our benefit programs, other than Social Security and the major healthcare programs, eligibility depends mostly on the incomes relative to prices, and the amount of benefits are geared relative to prices, not wages, and therefore relative to overall incomes, spending on these programs is projected to decline. The other reason these projections show a decline is that our annual appropriations for the spending on the military and a number of domestic needs are projected under law to be constant in real dollars and therefore to decline relative to GDP. But in fact, policymakers have not let these things come true in the past few decades. The big decline you see in this picture from the mid-1970s through the late 1990s is mostly a reduction in defense spending relative to the size of our economy. That so-called peace dividend ran its course by the late 1990s. And since then, this series has really moved sideways as a trend, although you can see these very pronounced spikes during and after the two macroeconomic crises. So if policymakers actually let this spending decline relative to GDP, that would be unusual by our recent history. From a projections perspective, this is probably too optimistic. And then last but not least, net interest spending to cover the interest payments on our debt, are projected to increase rapidly. Notice first that interest payments are not that large now relative to GDP, even though our debt is quite high. And that is true, of course, because interest rates are low. And I'll come back to that topic shortly. But interest payments are projected to rise over time, both because of some increase in interest rates and because of the surge in outstanding federal debt. Meanwhile, revenues are projected to rise relative to GDP, but that also would be unusual historically. You can see in the history here for individual income taxes, numerous peaks and valleys. But that pattern reflects a couple of factors. One is economic conditions. Strong economies push up revenue relative to the size of the economy. Weak economies pull down revenues. This also, though, reflects the dynamic between the tax code and policymakers. In a stable economy, and even with our tax code that is now largely indexed to inflation, growth in inflation-adjusted incomes over time tend to push people into higher tax brackets, and therefore the effective average tax rate rises without any deliberate change by policymakers. Well, then as tax revenues rise relative to GDP, policymakers take the opportunity to cut tax rates. And so there's been a back and forth of the upward trends and the deliberate efforts to cut taxes that have led to this series going more or less sideways on average over the last several decades. And so what was projected here is under current law, revenue will rise relative to GDP. But again, if policymakers let that happen, that would be unusual based on their historical experience. So even though this is the official projection, it requires a different sort of behavior by policymakers in the future. The other piece of other revenue has trended down a bit and is projected to be roughly stable relative to GDP in the future. Now, as one considers possible changes in tax policy going forward, I think it's important to understand what has happened to tax rates in the past. This picture shows the Congressional Budget Office's estimates of average federal tax rates over time for households in different slices of the income distribution. For each group, each point on each line, the calculation is overall taxes paid, including both income taxes paid and payroll taxes paid, and imputed business taxes paid by that household, divided by a household's total income, including both taxable income and benefits that are not taxed. What you can see here is that tax rates have fallen considerably over time for the lowest quintile, the lowest 1/5 of the income distribution, and also for the next few quintiles, and even the 81st to 99th percentile, so the top quintile not counting the top 1%. Only for that top 1% have tax rates not come down. The top 1%, the average tax rate now is roughly what it has been on average over the past 40 years. Now, of course, most Americans do not think that they're paying less in taxes, and they don't think they're paying too little in taxes. But I believe these estimates are correct. Now, interest rates on Treasury debt are something we should spend a little time on because they are so critical for the dynamics of federal debt, dynamics of debt in any country. U.S. Treasury debt, look at just the solid part of that line. U.S. Treasury debt trended down rather sharply from the late 1990s into the late 2000s. That's not unique for the United States. The U.S. government has enjoyed lower borrowing costs, but so have other governments in many advanced economies, and indeed many private borrowers in many advanced economies. This figure and the next few figures show the yield on 10-year Treasury notes after subtracting inflation, presented as a 5-year moving average to smooth through the year-to-year fluctuations. This yield dropped markedly, as I said, in the late 1990s and 2000s. But in 2009, at least, the Congressional Budget Office and many other forecasters expected this interest rate to rebound. So there's the 2009 projection showing the jump after the projected jump after the financial crisis and recession. But then, in fact, interest rates did not jump up. They fell further, and that forecast seemed untenable. So in 2014, time when I was happened to be CBO director, we developed an approach in which we chose a set of factors important for interest rates, forecasted how each of those factors would differ in the future from the past, and then put those pieces back together again for an overall projection. You can see the projection that we landed on in 2015 was a good deal lower than the projection CBO had used before that. And a good deal, and then what happened, I'm sorry, is that more time has passed. CBO updates this approach regularly. Here is their latest projection from 2023. There's a very large dip in the real interest rate because of the surge in inflation, but that's not so important for our current purpose. What matters for this discussion is the projection in the future is below what the projection was several years ago, even further below the projection in 2009. Inflation-adjusted Treasury interest rates that had been projected to converge on 3% are now projected to converge to 2%, notwithstanding there being substantially more debt from the federal government in the world than there was projected to be in 2009. This is a very significant difference, motivated again by the decline that we've observed and analysis of it. This sort of analysis and forecast is not unique to CBO. Various identifiable factors have reduced the demand for loanable funds relative to their supply. Factors that include slower labor force growth, reducing the need for investment, slower productivity growth, having the same effect, and a global increase in private saving. These factors are not likely to reverse anytime soon. Of course, there are factors pushing in the other direction, including the recent increases in government debt in many countries, and perhaps an increase now in the inflation risk premium. But careful quantification of this large set of factors is consistent with the trend decline in rates that we've seen and imply fairly low rates in the future. For example, the International Monetary Fund has concluded that when inflation eases, interest rates will revert toward their pre-pandemic levels. And you can see a similar outlook in financial markets directly. The yield on 30-year inflation-indexed Treasury securities is now below 2%. So one crucial implication is that the unsustainability of US fiscal policy is a significant problem, but not an urgent one. Lower interest rates reduce the pace at which debt builds up for any given non-interest deficit, which makes reducing deficits less urgent. In addition, lower interest rates probably show that the cost to the economy of government borrowing is lower, which also makes reducing deficits less urgent. The intuition is simply that low interest rates are a sign that investable funds are available in large quantities relative to businesses and households' needs. So the crowding out of household and business borrowing is less costly than it would be if funds were scarcer. Now, more research is needed on this issue, in particular because the signal of low rates for economic costs depends on the reason that rates are low, and there are multiple reasons today that rates are low. But I think the most appropriate interpretation of the research done so far is that the economic costs, in addition to the budget costs of government debt, are probably lower than they've been in the past. But I want to say, and clearly, that even though delaying action is probably less damaging than we previously believed, there are still good reasons to put fiscal policy on a sustainable path. More debt leads to less private investment, which probably lowers future output and income. More debt increases the risk of a fiscal and financial crisis. More debt increases the vulnerability of the budget to potential increases in interest rates. More debt reduces fiscal space for responding to emerging public needs. And enacting significant changes in policy in advance gives families and businesses time to plan ahead. So I'm not arguing that we should avoid reducing deficits and debt, but I am emphasizing that the urgency of doing so is less than many of us would have expected a few years ago. Now, putting fiscal policy on a sustainable path would require significant changes in policy. To remind you, just to keep to the projections I showed earlier, policymakers would need to let the 2017 tax cuts expire as scheduled, to allow this real bracket creep to increase revenue relative to GDP in an historically atypical way, to keep other spending on a downward path in a historically atypical way. That's just to make the projections I showed come true. To actually stabilize debt relative to GDP near its current level, policymakers need to do all of those things, and this is an estimate from last year's CBO's projections, to reduce spending or raise revenue or some combination by almost 3% of GDP. That's roughly $2,400 per person in the United States, about 340,000 yen. All the potential changes have significant substantive disadvantages and significant political opposition. Neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party is focused on this issue now in the way that they were a decade ago. The debt ceiling dispute was resolved with tweaks to budget policies, not fundamental changes, not the changes of the magnitude that were discussed 10, 15 years ago when there were debates about raising the debt ceiling. Republicans, I think, have learned from Democrats to say they'll protect Social Security and Medicare. And moreover, the political energy and the conservative side of American politics is more focused on cultural issues than economic issues now. At the same time, Democrats have learned from Republicans to say they won't raise taxes on anyone except the very wealthy. And the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has gained strength, is strongly against cutting any kind of social spending. So there's substantial disadvantages to the change, any of the changes one would propose, and a distinct lack of eagerness, even exceeding previous reluctance to make the changes that would be needed. And so I think there is no near-term prospect of significant changes in U.S. budget policy. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug, for a very insightful discussion. Now we will move on to the panel discussion. Each panelist has 10 minutes for comments. And first, I'd like to invite Professor Auerbach.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak after Doug Elmendorf gave such a clear presentation. And I am very pleased to say that I agree with everything Doug said. And I guess I would say that people who have thought, who've looked at the data and the projections and thought seriously about them, as Doug has, would find it very difficult to disagree very much with what he said. But unfortunately, that's not simply agreeing with his prognosis, but also agreeing with his final, in terms of the projections, but also agreeing with his analysis of the likelihood that things will be dealt with. And I just want to expand on these comments and not really add much to the basic data and projections that he showed. So my outline is very short. I'm going to try to say a little bit more about how bad the U.S. situation is right now, and then expand a little bit on Doug's discussion about prospects for moving from our current trajectory. So how bad is the current U.S. situation? Well, I'm going to be working also with CBO projections. This reflects some work I've done in a paper in the last few weeks with Bill Gale at the Brookings Institution, starting with data and projections from the Congressional Budget Office. And what you see here are four series, the historical series that you will have seen in Doug's slides, showing the net debt to GDP ratio through the present, and then three sets of projections. The solid dark line being the CBO projections from 1 year ago, the dashed line, the dark dashed line being the CBO projections from this summer. And then the red dotted line, which I will call a current policy projection, which to refer to Doug's presentation, he said there were a variety of things that would be needed to follow the CBO projection, but perhaps were unlikely. And the red dotted line is our assessment of what's more likely, which we call a current policy projection rather than a current law projection. That is, if the government, as we would expect it will, extends tax cuts that are in the process of expiring, if it follows a more historically likely trajectory for spending programs other than old age entitlements and so forth. And I want to make a couple of points about this picture. First of all, very little has changed in the projections, the two dark lines, the solid line, which was from last year, and the dashed line, which is from this year. And that's noteworthy because there was a budget crisis in June, leading up to which Republicans were arguing that they insisted on very steep budget cuts in order for them to agree to raise the debt ceiling and avoid default by the federal government on the national debt. In the end, there were cuts agreed to, but as Doug mentioned, the Republicans had decided not to touch the fastest growing and most popular programs, old age entitlement programs. And so in a sense, very little happened. We ended up having a slight reduction in the debt trajectory as a result, which was more or less balanced by budget deficit increasing policies that have been adopted in the past year. So we basically made no progress over the last year, the fact that we had a budget deal notwithstanding. But things look a lot worse under this current policy scenario, the red dotted line, which again is our assessment of where we are in terms of our policy path if no changes in our policy trajectory occur. And to say a little bit more about what underlies these projections, these are under this most recent CBO projections for current law. These show the composition of the budget over time. And you can see certain things growing, the light blue line at the top being our old age pension, Social Security payments, the even more rapidly growing purple dashed line, which is our Medicare program, old age health care. And the fastest growing line of all, the red dashed line, is interest payments, which by the end of the sample period, the projection period, will be the largest component of the federal budget, of roughly 7% of GDP devoted to interest payments. At the same time, this all hinges on other programs going down. In particular, the orange dashed line at the bottom being our defense spending, falling as a share of GDP to between 2 and 3% of GDP, which is historically extremely low for the United States and very, very unlikely to occur. Likewise, the green line, which is our whole other category, non-defense discretionary spending. And if the programs that are basically insulated from policy cuts grow as they're projected to grow, and the other policy and the other areas more or less stay in proportion to GDP as they have historically, things are going to look a lot like the current policy projections that I just showed you in the previous slide. So the key question, given this dismal trajectory, is what the prospects for progress are. Doug pointed out that Democrats have adopted a position that the only tax increases will be on the very wealthy. That's not a recent development. It really, I think it goes back at least 30 years, when under President Clinton, taxes were increased on the top 2% of the income distribution only. There were income tax increases at the very top and on no one else. And I think that was sort of the beginning of that solidifying, and a position that's become solidified since then among Democrats, that tax increases are unacceptable unless they're only on the very top. And that is certainly the current position of the Biden administration. And Republicans have certainly, not moved away from caring about the deficit. But until perhaps the last 10 or 15 years, there was still serious concern, at least among some policymakers, about deficits. You can see this in the 1990 budget agreement under the first President Bush. You could see this during the Clinton administration, the adoption of budget caps, and the appearance of budget surpluses in the late 1990s. You can see it during the Obama administration with the appointment of a commission, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, to seek budget solutions. But somehow things have sort of going away from that, particularly during the Trump and the Biden administrations. And to illustrate this, over the years, I've estimated equations relating the budget actions the extent to which they were deficit increasing or deficit decreasing, and how these are related to the budget situation, as well as the state of the economy. Until about a dozen years ago or so, it was fairly predictable that when the deficit got bigger, government was more likely, given the state of the economy, government was more likely to adopt deficit decreasing measures, tax increases, spending cuts. That's no longer true. Since around 2010, it's no longer true. Government policy now ignores the state of the budget. And the question is why? So I think Doug's explanation is that the parties have learned. They've learned to take positions that are appealing to voters. I think there are other factors, that complementary to this. One thing I think matters is that the parties in the United States have become polarized. It used to be the case that members of parties sort of overlapped in their views of a number of issues, which means that it was easier to form coalitions and achieve objectives that were common across party lines. This was certainly true of budget agreements in 1990, when Congress was controlled by Democrats and the president was a Republican. The parties have become polarized and now find it very, very difficult to reach any kind of agreements on politically sensitive issues. And I think that's certainly one factor. I think another factor is that when politicians or economists try to explain to people what problem deficits involve, it's very difficult to talk about long-run considerations. And so it has been more typical to talk about the short-run effects. Deficits raise interest rates, deficits cause inflation. Well, one of the problems is that hasn't been true. Doug showed you a picture of ever declining levels and projections of interest rates that we've experienced in the United States over the last several years. And if people are told that deficits are bad because of these short-run effects as a way of trying to make deficits more salient, and then these effects aren't observed, people sort of lose interest and turn away, and are certainly not going to support policies that may cause direct pain in terms of tax increases or cuts in spending programs that they like, in exchange for a benefit that they find hard to see. So I think that the prospects for change, it's true, we had a spike in inflation last year, and at least some of it may have been attributable to the very, very large spending that we adopted during COVID and afterward. But I don't think that a connection has been made by voters. And so I think that there's very little interest among American voters in policies that would involve fiscal consolidation. And there's very little goodwill in Congress between the two parties that would enable them to come to any kind of consensus agreement, which I think would be necessary to make tough choices. So I think we're going to be on this trajectory for a while, and things are likely to have to get worse before any serious action is undertaken. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alan, for an extremely insightful and important and valuable comments. Thank you. Then I'd like to invite Professor Koeda.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very honored to be here today. In my short discussion, I'd like to talk about macroeconomic effect of government debt moving away from the Ricardian equivalence, given that the CBO project somewhat an explosive path of government debt going forward. Maybe I could start with this Professor Elmendorf included this statement in his slide, although he emphasized that lower interest rates make reducing deficit less urgent. But maybe I thought we could start with this sentence for the sake of discussion. More debt leads to less private investment, which probably lowers future output and income. What are possible underlying mechanisms here? Depending on the mechanisms, implications for the US economy and for the rest of the world can be different. A good starting point could be Elmendorf and Mankew's 1999 paper. I find many of their discussion in their paper still apply today. Since it's an influential paper, many of us may already know about the parable of debt fairy. What if the debt fairy one day replaces every US government bond into a piece of US capital? What are the implications to the debt service burden, GDP, and return to capital? Also, their paper put together some national accounting identities. So here, S stands for private saving, I stand for domestic investment, NFI, net foreign investment. And this expression inside parentheses corresponds to fiscal deficit. So if the US government runs very large fiscal deficit, it may be the case that domestic investment is discouraged, given that private saving does not go up as much and NFI does not go down as much. Of course, these are all endogenous variables, and there may be other theoretical possibilities. So to elaborate on this, I'd like to go over a few basic Japanese data together with the US projections presented by Professor Elmendorf. So here on the left-hand side, we have US population 65 and older. So it's about 17% now, and it's expected to increase or in the next 20 years, it is expected to be over 20%. On the right-hand side, we have the share of Japanese population 65 and older. It was 17% already in the year of 2000, and Japan had aged rapidly in the 2000s and 2010s, and it is now nearly 30%. On the left-hand side, we have US federal debt projection. So we can see the debt is projected to be somewhat following an expansionary path, particularly under the low productivity growth scenario. It could reach nearly 200% of GDP in 20 years. On the right, we have debt security outstanding in Japan. Central government debt is mostly in the form of Japanese government bond and bills, and it was about 80% in 2000, and in 20 years, it reached over 200%. While Japan has accumulated huge amount of government debt, interest rate projections have been revised downward. So on the right-hand side, we have Cabinet Office of Japan's real interest rate baseline projections. And the definition for real interest rate is this expression inside the parentheses. And if you could see, let's say the blue dot on the left, I hope the pointer is working. So this blue dot corresponds to Cabinet Office real interest rate baseline projection for 2015 as of June 2010. On the left-hand side, we can see that the real interest rate projections for the US have been revised downward. So there has been a downward trend in interest rate. And as a result, net interest has been contained in Japan and also in the United States in the past 20 years. But going forward, net interest for the United States is expected to go up at a notable pace with moderate level of nominal interest rate. So this figure shows the volume of gross investment. The blue line shows the volume gross investment, the baseline is 2015, we can see that it did not grow over the last two decades. So going back to the earlier statement, does this statement apply to Japan? Well, a crowding out scenario might not be very convincing scenario since the interest rate kept falling, but there may be other possibilities. For example, secular stagnation, I think, is a popular view, and perhaps caused by democratic factors that could discourage domestic investment. And as a result, government borrowed. And if we go along with this line of discussion, then the first part of this sentence, maybe regarding the first part of this sentence, we can also think about the possibility of reverse causality. Because private investment was discouraged, government had to borrow. Another important view can be international capital flow view, because Japanese companies find more investment opportunities abroad. NFI went down and went up. Sorry, NFI went up, and domestic investment was discouraged. I think these two lines of discussion may apply to the US going forward to some certain extent, because US is expecting to age going forward. So maybe under the secular stagnation, trend effect coming from democratic factors or other factor might be important for the projecting investment and output going forward. And also international capital flow view, if the US accept large amount of capital inflows from foreign country, it might be the case that NFI can go down, and domestic investment might not be discouraged, even when the government runs very large fiscal deficit. So this line of thought can imply very different implications for the rest of the world, and also the US economic growth outlook. Let me now wrap up my discussion. So I have briefly discussed the macroeconomic effect of government debt and lessons from the Japanese economy. I would like to emphasize here, there are many related important academic studies on Japan. I actually almost had a list, and I almost had a list, go over the list of literatures, but I don't have time to do that today. We have Professor Auerbach here today as a panelist, and in addition, in this room, the authors of these related studies are here in this room. So in addition, I think there are international journals focusing on the Japanese economy, such as JJIE. They have many more references. So we could refer to those existing studies to draw lessons from Japan. Another remark I would like to make is that this Elmendorf's Mankiw's paper also lists other possible effects of government debt. And one of the list include government debt can affect monetary policy. I think this is a timely, this statement is quite timely to the extent that fiscal expansion is inflationary. Monetary policy may have to react to higher inflation with higher interest rate. That can have significant impact on international capital flows and exchange rate, affecting other countries, including Japan. Lastly, I have compared US projections with some basic Japanese data in the past, but I think it's also relevant to compare the US projection with the latest economic projection in Japan. The latest medium and long-term projection from Cabinet Office of Japan has just released last week. I think it's very relevant to compare two sets of projections for our discussion. This ends my discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koeda. some, and I'd like to invite Mr. Sato on the screen from Washington, D.C. Can you hear me?
Thank you. It's my honor to join you virtually this afternoon in Tokyo. Here in Washington, D.C., it's quite early in the morning. This is a good way to start my day. As an economic counselor of the Embassy of Japan since August 2020, I have been following U.S. economy and economic policy from Washington, D.C. since the height of pandemic. And from that perspective, I would like to offer some lessons for future fiscal policy. The US fiscal system is quite unique with rules that do not exist in other countries. And every time they pass a bill on the budget or debt ceiling, it takes time to negotiate within Congress and with the administration. In the time it takes for these negotiations, there is often uncertainty in the economy and market, both domestically and internationally. On the other hand, it is also true that US fiscal policy has brought about various spillovers at home and abroad, including during the pandemic. It is extremely important for the global economy and international finance to understand US fiscal policy trends. So I would like to share my slide I prepared now. Let me see. Okay. Okay, this figure shows the effect of the component of fiscal policy under the pandemic, and unemployment benefit and direct benefit to household boosted GDP significantly. Fiscal stimulus can have an immediate effect in compensating for demand shortfalls. So in the event of a recession, it is important to take stimulus measures on a sufficient scale based on the appropriate and also prompt assessment of the situation. And also, it is important to leave fiscal space for the future. While it is important to note that uniqueness of this business cycle, one lesson to be learned is that expansion of demand could lead to soaring inflation. Many economists agree that demand factors were major reason for US inflation. And as you can see in the figure on the right, fiscal policy was one of those factors. It is difficult to assess whether inflation or recession would cause greater economic losses, but how smoothly inflation settles down to the 2% level without a great increase of unemployment in the future is one of the most important factors in evaluating fiscal policy under the pandemic. The increasing possibility of a soft landing at this point might be positive for this evaluation. In order to control this inflation, monetary policy played a major role in the United States, and a series of tightening was implemented. The majority of the increased US bond was absorbed by the market. As a result, interest rates have been rising since last year. The long-term interest rate, both for nominal and real term, have not risen as much as the short-term rates, but they are higher than they were before the pandemic. So for short-term fiscal policy, there are some suggestions, such as strengthening of automatic stabilizers. So I would like to ask you, Professor Elmendorf, how you assess the lesson to be learned from this experience, given the scale and content of fiscal stimulus. Next, I would like to see how these changes in economic condition have impacted their fiscal situation over the long term. Here, I compare the CBO3 projection. Pre-pandemic is gray line, immediately after the pandemic projection is blue line, and most recent one is orange line. For the economic recovery after the pandemic, real GDP returned to its pre-pandemic level more quickly than was projected up immediately after the pandemic. Nominal GDP on the right-hand side has already exceeded its pre-pandemic level with additional impact of inflation. For the impact on the public finances, the debt to GDP ratio has risen compared to its pre-pandemic level due to the issuance of government bond associated with several stimulus packages. Comparing the immediately after the pandemic projection to the most recent one, the early economic recovery led to a temporary decline in the debt level, but the pace of debt increase is expected to accelerate in the future. I would like to see the reason of this deterioration in the budget deficit from this figure. It's due in large part to additional fiscal stimulus under the Biden administration, which increased budget deficit in 2021, and also plus a permanent increase in net interest expense due to higher debt level and higher interest rates. So in sum, from a fiscal perspective, the early economic recovery itself is positive, but synergistic effect of the bond issuance along with the stimulus package and interest rate hikes associated with a swelling inflation have canceled out any positive effects. So when the debt to GDP ratio gets large, as in Japan, attention should be paid to the vulnerability of debt to changes in interest rates. So how do you think this risk should be managed as a rule in a fiscal policy management? Currently, since 2021, the focus of fiscal policy has shifted to expand supply capacity. Fiscal policy has aimed to promote the strengthening of the middle class, restructuring domestic industry, and measures to combat climate change. President Biden insists that public investment induces private investment, and it is the basis for the government commitment to fiscal policy over a 5 to 10-year period. So it would be meaningful to note that when introducing new fiscal policy in the United States, CBO every time identified the impact it will have on the fiscal balance over a 10-year period. While the Biden administration infrastructure and semiconductor policies were based on financial resources through borrowing, the budget deficit, the Inflation Reduction Act determined a set of commensurate revenues along with spending on climate change in order to aim for fiscal neutrality in the long run. In addition, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, passed after the debt ceiling negotiation last June, caps discretionary spending for 2 years to improve the fiscal balance. Thus, the trend of fiscal policy is toward the adoption of medium to long-term fiscal policy, as well as a certain degree of fiscal discipline. As a background, in addition to higher inflation, the opinions of Republican conservatives and others who desire small government are influencing policy formation as Congress becomes more polarized. However, as Professor Elmendorf and Professor Auerbach told, while these fiscal balance improvement effects are significant in that they do not further worsen the fiscal situation, but they have only negligible effect in terms of changing overall trend. So as mentioned in Professor Elmendorf presentation, the factor that determines the overall fiscal trend is the balance of mandatory expenditure, such as Social Security and healthcare. The CBO's proposal for improving the fiscal deficit indicates that tax reforms and revision of mandatory spending will have a greater impact on improving the deficit. Politically, these policies are not currently under discussion, but they will have to be discussed if a change in fiscal trend is eventually necessary. So it has been pointed out that these Social Security and healthcare funds will run out money in the coming future. So as Professor Elmendorf said, that near-term prospects for this reform is not, we cannot say that, but what reform do you think should be implemented before that kind of fund will run out of money? And how do you prospect toward these reforms? So finally, in response to the dynamic economic fluctuation and changes in political environment in United States, fiscal policy has also changed in terms of background ideas and areas of focus. As a mechanism to support these changes, it is important to note that policy decisions have been made based on various data provided by Congress and the government. I stop here my presentation and return mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sato-san, for a fascinating discussion. So now we have comments and questions from the panelists. So Doug, could you respond to them?
Thank you all very much. I found very interesting and agree with so much of what Alan and Junko and Kaneda have said. I'll pick up on a couple of topics, but I can't do justice to all of the good points. The first thing to say is that I agree very much with Alan Auerbach's view about the problems that increased polarization in US policy for addressing our budget outlook and a number of other important challenges. I also think Alan is right that the lack of observed negative consequences of the deficits that we've run has undermined the anti-deficit caucus in both parties and in the United States. Even the inflation of the last few years, which I do think stems in significant part from expansionary fiscal policy. It's not clear people will link that to deficits, as Alan mentioned. One challenge is that for many people in our country, the fiscal policy piece they connect to inflation is government spending, not the difference between government spending and taxes. I think from an economics perspective, it is the gap between spending and taxes that is the influence on aggregate demand and thus on inflation. But that's not the way a number of people in our country tell the story. And when people note that Republicans don't maybe worry as much about deficits when it comes to tax cuts, I think the logic in their minds is that the problem is spending, not the deficit. And so even to the extent to which the recent high inflation is attributed to fiscal policy, it's not clear that the attribution will be to deficits per se. Both Junko and Kaneda drew our attention to the interaction of fiscal policy with monetary policy and with issues of full employment and the economy operating at potential output. This is a very important topic that I didn't have time to talk about, but I think they're right to raise it. I worry a fair bit about secular stagnation in the United States. I think a number of the factors that led to low equilibrium interest rates in the 20-teens will be back, are still there, are just being masked now by the effects of the pandemic and the very dramatic fiscal expansion. and response to the pandemic. But I think the risk will be back that the US economy will suffer from some of what Japan's economy has suffered from in terms of weak aggregate demand, and fiscal policy plays a role there. I think although Greg Mankiw and I think we're right to note that fiscal policy can have effects on monetary policy, I don't think that the Federal Reserve Board's and FOMC's reactions to recent events have been driven in any way by an attempt to cover for large deficits. I do think the Federal Reserve responded too slowly to the surge of inflation in 2021, but I don't think that was in any way an effort to make the Biden administration or the fiscal policy look good. That I think was a misjudgment on the Fed's part. And so I think that the Federal Reserve will shed the extra debt they've acquired when they think that's appropriate in terms of macroeconomic stability. Last thing let me comment on is what sorts of changes I think would make sense for US fiscal policy. I'll highlight 2 points here. One is that a significant number of Americans have not benefited very much from the overall economic growth in our country over the past few decades. And that is an economic problem. Has also become a political problem because these people who have not benefited are justifiably frustrated with that situation. And so I think changes in fiscal policy need to be very careful not to further hamper those people's economic opportunities. The second point to emphasize, related point, but we're stressing separately, is that there's growing evidence in the United States context and in some other countries that I've seen that the right kinds of investments in poor young people are very good for them, not only while they are young, but also later in their lives. And that's not just education, which one thinks of naturally, but also of nutrition and healthcare and other factors. And so any cutbacks in programs focused on lower income Americans, I think risk not only short-term harm to people whom we should be helping, but also risk longer-term harm to them and to the economy as a whole. And so cutting spending in ways that don't damage our future outlook is an important aspect of the choices we have to make. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Now, I'd like to open the floor. And if you have a comment or question, please raise your hand or your nameplate. And we also have our online audience. For the online audience, please send your question or comment in English via Q&A function of the Zoom. Before you start, please indicate your name and affiliation and specify which speaker you would like to ask. And so, gentlemen, please.
Thanks for the really great panel. This is Neil Marotra from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I guess my question for the panel and you know for Doug and Alan, I guess specifically, is you. I think your remarks seems to suggest that we've gotten the balance of fiscal policy wrong over the last couple decades in terms of an imbalance in too high primary deficits and an unsustainable fiscal path. So to which country would you point as a superior example of fiscal policy management with superior macroeconomic outcomes?
That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer just because I'd want to think about it. But let me say something about the premise of your question. I wouldn't say so much that our problem in the last couple of decades has been the primary deficits we've run. I would say that given the nature of the fiscal imbalances that we have, the failure we've experienced in the last couple of decades is the failure to undertake any reforms of our old age entitlement programs, which have built-in growth, which is the major underlying driver of our long-run imbalances. I would have been happy if, in terms of our fiscal policy imbalances, I would have been happy with the primary deficits we were running, or at least I would have accepted them over the last couple of decades if we had undertaken structural reforms to our old age entitlement programs, because that's what really is ultimately needed, unless we're planning on very, very large tax increases. And the fact that we didn't undertake any of these, even during strong economic times, before the baby boom generation hit retirement age, means that we've lost. We certainly haven't lost the opportunity to undertake reform now, but the reforms undertaken earlier would have been much more valuable than and would have had much more of a fiscal payoff than they ultimately will whenever it is we adopt them.
Yeah, so I agree with Alan. It's a good question about other countries, and I will think more about that. And if you have something in mind, I'd be happy to hear that. My concern about the US, again, echoing Alan, is not that we should have had dramatic reductions in observed deficits. I think, in fact, at the time, with all those years when the federal funds rate was essentially at zero, further reductions in deficits would have slowed the economy, pushed up unemployment. And I was one of the people who believed very much in 2010, 11, 12, that we should have had larger deficits to bring the economy more quickly back out of the great financial crisis-induced recession. But there's certainly a lot of political benefit in building in changes slowly rather than have them take effect right away. I think one can make changes in the short run if one has to, but it's better to lay these things in. As you know, the eligibility age for full benefits and Social Security in the US is now going up through legislation that was enacted more than 40 years ago. And so that's an argument for making reforms ahead of when you need those changes to take effect. I would also say that it is not just the spending side, it is also the revenue side where we, I think, do need to make changes. And I think ultimately we'll make more changes on the revenue side than the spending side, because for all of the general concern about government spending in the abstract, these programs for older Americans are very popular in the specifics. And I think we'll raise taxes. And there are things one can do to a tax code to make raising taxes a less distorting activity, and we should have done some of that.
Dan. Questions? Oh, yes. Gentleman over there.
Thank you very much for the panel, and this is great discussion. And I mean, as an academic for 35 years, including PhD 40 plus, I've always hoped that Social Security would never be reformed. Otherwise, I would lose my job. And I turned out to be correct. I mean, if you show from Doug's slides, pages 11 and 13 to anybody, and say, well, the kind of the blues and the reds don't quite align. What do you think is a problem? As both of you mentioned, entitlements. And it's given the popularity, the only other option is raising taxes. And that ties back to Neil's question. And I think over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll probably look more like maybe France or Germany or Italy than what we were accustomed to in the US. I don't see any other solution given the current climate. And I'm glad I'm going to retire soon.
Can I say part of the issue, I think, is that for an average individual, they feel very much that they've earned their benefits in retirement. The fact that there are more of them, so the aggregate cost is larger, it's just not such a natural thing for the average person to take on board or to think is sort of somehow their fault and therefore they should be responsible for making up for that. And I think this contrast between the individual level experience and what we see in the aggregate numbers is a real problem.
Other comments, discussion? Oh, excuse me. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, it's Roshuji from Hitotsubashi University, Japan. Thank you for a great presentation. And I think this is going to be mainly for the two speakers from the United States. So you have convinced me that the current fiscal path is unsustainable, just as it is in our country. So I would like to know the following. So is it, when it finally comes time to actually make an adjustment, you have to face it. Would it be ideal or really even realistic to exclude monetary policy, the role of monetary policy from the picture? In the case of Japan, the central bank holds a huge half of the long-term government bonds. And when it comes time for normalization, they're going to have to be paying lots of interest on excess reserves. If we're going to adjust only through raising taxes, it's going to mean a huge, it could mean a huge tax increases. So maybe a combination of tax increases with a moderate inflation, or maybe cutting interest payments on bank reserves so that the banks will have to suffer. But some kind of combination between the fiscal adjustment and some kind of monetary adjustment, could it be a realistic or more desirable option? That's my question. Thank you.
I think this approach you're suggesting has very large risks, and I would not put that strategy among my top 5 or 10 strategies. I think for a central bank to absorb a lot of debt without leading to high inflation is a hard thing for me to understand, really. And the high inflation only helps a little bit in a way, right? A sudden surge of inflation can reduce the value of outstanding debt. Expected high inflation pushes up the interest rates that people demand to hold the debt. But I just don't think, in addition to all the other damage that inflation can do to an economy. So I don't think that's really a good strategy to follow. I think whether you can make other people hold debt, for example, by changing financial regulation, right? And this sort of financial repression has been used at various times in the past, including in the United States in some ways, to hold down interest rates. There's probably some room for action there. I'm not an expert in financial regulation. My sense is that there's currently a fair amount of required holding of safe assets that leads to demand for treasury debt. You know, if we had more private saving in the United States to soak up more of the debt, that would help too. But we don't really know how to accomplish that either. And so I think mostly this is going to have to be done by pushing those lines together. The last thing to say is that if we had a one-off surge in debt, you might say, let's find some way to get somebody to absorb that. But when the projection is just, as is in Japan, just ever rising amounts of debt, you really have to change that trajectory in the long run.
Yeah, I would just add, in thinking about the role of inflation and leaving aside the costs of inflation, inflation will for initially, as Doug says, only initially, might help with the erode the existing value of debt. It's going to do nothing to the long run imbalances, because those are real imbalances between spending and taxes. And so you may simply delay the need to deal with the problem by lowering the amount of debt, but you still have to deal with the problem, and that's going to take some realignment between taxes and spending. I think one of the problems is when we finally have to deal with it, particularly if any of the changes are to be made in these long run entitlement these old age entitlement programs, you can't really make any changes in the very short run to these programs that will have any immediate payoff. The payoff will be years into the future. And so if one thinks of our dealing with this problem through crisis management rather than through long-term planning, it doesn't fit well with the nature of the underlying problem, which makes it more likely that it'll come through tax policy, I think, because that's something that can be adjusted more quickly. It may be in the guise of taxes on entitlement on Social Security benefits or things like that, but ultimately any responses that are not longer term in nature may be more likely to be on the tax side.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? No comments? Everything is crystal clear? Oh, yes.
One possible risk which can be urgent.
Could you identify yourself name?
Oh,
and
right.
place?
Sorry about it. Masao Gaki, Keio University. And I guess this is mainly for two professors from USA. And maybe Professor Koeda too. And this is about real interest rate. If the real interest rate suddenly rises, I think many US and Japan will be in trouble. That can be urgent. And one possible risk seems to be in technology that I think one reason that demand side for loanable funds has been low, maybe because of the main technology in recent years has been tangible capital rather than the physical capital. But technologies can change dramatically. For example, with artificial intelligence and other things, suddenly maybe real interest rate may rise. Should we worry about this or not? What do you think?
Yes, I think we should worry about that risk. But we should recognize that there are risks in different directions. And so the one thing that happened over the past decade was that interest rates were surprisingly low. That's a risk we needed to be ready for in ways I'm not sure we totally thought through. It's also true rates could be surprisingly high, and we should be ready for that. I do think that taking action sooner to address fiscal imbalance, as in the US or in Japan, is useful insurance against the risk of rates rising. And that's one of the reasons why I think action sooner is better rather than later. But we should just not view this as only a one-sided risk, because there are two sides and both sides had their disadvantages.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with the professor that could be a risk, but I think there are other risks. For example, when we think about the very large government bond market, this very large rollover risk going forward can be a big risk. So I think it's really the comparing risk, what risks are more likely to be worried. Thank you very much.
Other comments? Ah, yes, Kiyotaki-sensei.
I understand the deficit prospect is long run in nature. So one of them is related to aging populations, but the meaning of aging may change too. People live longer and also healthy. Then most natural solution is increasing retirement age, so that revenue go up and spending go down. Seems to be the most natural solution to me. And as you said, it takes long time, so you cannot raise the retirement age suddenly because of people get surprised. But over the next 20, 30, 40 years, you raise gradually, seems to be the most natural solution to me. How do you think?
Well, just two comments on that. First of all, you can see how smoothly this went in France recently. To know that it's a very simple policy to undertake. I guess another issue that's come up in the US in this context when talking about the increasing the retirement age, and this may be a specific problem to the US, I'm not sure how much it is true in other countries. There's been a divergence in life expectancy in the US between high and low income groups. And given that old age pensions are basically an annuity, a policy of uniformly raising the retirement age would, in terms of the value of benefits received, hit lower income groups on average more heavily than higher income groups. So I think some thought should be given. I mean, it's sort of a shame. This is policies that would take time to work out and certainly would need to be implemented very gradually. Would need to take these factors like that into consideration. But I certainly agree with you in principle that if the our retirement age, as normal retirement age was 65 in the 1930s when the Social Security system was adopted, and it's just now risen to 67, and life expectancy has certainly increased by more during that very long period.
So I agree with Alan's raising this issue of the dispersion of outcomes within the U.S. I would just add that this legislation under which the retirement age has increased, which was passed in 1983, was passed at a moment when the Social Security Trust Fund was just about to run out of money. And so in the United States, Social Security is financed in its own separate way, wrapped up in all the overall government projections I showed, but with a separate trust fund. It was about to run out of money. And the deal that was cut between the Republicans and Democrats 40 years ago not only solved the immediate problem, but it seemed at the time to put Social Security on a solid footing for the next 75 years. So those leaders used the moment of crisis to build in this very gradual increase in the retirement age and make other changes to the program as well. And one question for the U.S. will be when that trust fund again runs out of money, which it will in about a decade if we don't do anything, will that moment be used to make a set of longer term changes, or will it be covered up in some other fashion? But this also goes to Alan's earlier point, which is that this legislation 40 years ago only took full effect on the retirement age about now. And so it would have been a lot better if we'd done something again 20 years ago rather than waiting for now or 10 years from now, because then we'll be legislating changes if we do the same time path, legislating changes that'll take effect in the 2060s or 2070s. That's pretty far out along these explosive debt paths.
Thank you. Time is up, so I must conclude now. So to all the speakers, thank you very much for such a lively and insightful discussion. We truly appreciate your valuable contributions. And I also thank the online audience today for participation. So now let me conclude today's discussion by thanking all the speakers and the audience. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.